Hello, everybody. Today we're going to learn daily Tanya for Hey Tishrei Tafshin Pei. Hey, actually. Tafshin Pei. Hey, well, look at that. So, yesterday we did not have, we did not learn together. Um, there are a few reasons for that. One of them being that the subject matter is very, very difficult to explain. That's true today as well. But today instead of not going through the learning, we'll explain what we can, and we'll just read through what we can't, and hopefully God will count that as well. So we were talking in part about how the Malchus of one world becomes the Keter of the world below it. What does all that mean? Well, we could think of Keter and Malchut as the sort of two sides of a mediation between a bestower and a receiver. Okay? So, I mean, we could probably bring analogies to this from the world of computers. Think of a client and a server, and about sort of the kind of ways they need to interface with each other in order for anything to get through. Um, this, I think, might be actually more better understood on a personal level, being that all actors involved are persons. And so we could think of Keter. Keter is the way that the receiver opens up to the giver. What does that mean? That primarily involves faith. Now, in order to be on the sort of lower side, on the receiving side, and to receive from the higher place, you need to put some sort of faith into it. And the reason is because you can't comprehend it yourself. It by definition doesn't fit into the current structure that you currently inhabit, right? So there does need to be a sort of putting of faith of going beyond your own language, of going beyond your own sort of way of understanding the world. And the Malchus, which we've spoken about a little bit more, we could think of as the sort of process that needs to occur on the other end. So you have on the giving end, um, it's not so much faith as it is, you could say, love, I suppose. It's something like you, if you want to, let's say, convey some very abstract idea. So, in order to convey it to someone else, what you need to do is you need to kind of step into their shoes and see how you can also shrink this idea down properly and sort of properly structure it in a way that they'll understand. So, Malchus is about making space for that which is outside of yourself. Um, so you can see how on the these are the this is the way that the worlds and sort of all personal relationships are mediated. When there's a giver and a receiver, right? So somebody sort of thinks to themselves, well, how am I going to get into this other guy's shoes and explain to them what I'm trying to say? And the receiver has to go, I believe that this person is trying to tell me something I did not know, and maybe could not know without him telling me. So that's a way to understand the relationship between Keter and Malchus kind of on a personal level. But this is not strictly an analogy. I personally do believe that the best way to understand these Kabbalistic terms is not as sort of technical, sort of, what I said in the beginning, kind of client-server relationship, but as a fundamentally personal relationship. I think that's the real story. But so we're going to sort of go off of that. We're going to be talking about relationships of giving and receiving, or at least we're going to sort of brush over them. And we're going to explain the relationship between Torah and mitzvahs. Which one is higher? Which one comes from a higher place? And kind of how to properly understand their relationship. So let's get started after that long introduction. ובזה יובן היות המצוות במלכות ה' של שם הוויה. Okay, so according to what we explained earlier about mitzvahs being actions, right, and they're commands given to somebody who is not God, right, by God to someone else. So they belong in Malchus, which is, again, like we said, he's sort of making space for someone else. He's sort of acknowledging the existence of someone else. והתורה בזעיר אנפין, וו של שם הוויה. So the Torah comes from Zeir Anpin, which is the sort of, it's what you call a partsuf, and a partsuf is the best way to understand it might be as a constellation of spheres. These spheres are each sort of their distinct sort of modes in which God expresses his will. Of course, they each include each other, at least when we're talking about Olam HaTikkun. And the Partsufim is one of the ways which they include each other, so they make space for each other by acknowledging the sort of, but by their desire to fulfill God's will in Or Ein Sof instead of just trying to fulfill themselves to the utmost. So Partsuf, this constellation known as Zeir Anpin, is the six spheres that deal with God's attributes, that are God's attributes, and it's kind of how they work together and create a kind of coherent persona. Right? We talked about personal relationships. These Partsufim are fundamentally, you could think of them as personae, which God inhabits. And again, these are not personae that God inhabits in relationship to us. So they are the reason they're seen in this more personal way and relating to each other. These are sort of, again, kind of illustrations of the fact that God's will is fundamentally personal, and it's a personal will, and that's the way that it comes through. And so Zeir Anpin is God's attributes. It's sort of the persona of God's attributes, whereas the Torah comes from God's persona as Malchus. Okay. Hagam shelemala be'arich anpin, even though above in arich anpin, which literally translates to the long face, but obviously, to imagine it as a long face is a little bit ridiculous. That's obviously not a face that's long, but you could think of it as it's the persona of the sphere of Keter, which we talked about. So you can think of it as it's long, maybe because it extends from the infinite to the finite, right? So it's long in that sense, but it mediates the finite and the infinite. Right, so he said in Or Ein Sof hamitzvot hen begolgotha belavronit hi haolcha debepluktah desarei המתפלג על תרי"ג אורחי דאורייתא שבזה, ושורש התורה דנפקא בחוכמה עילה היא במחסתימה דאריך אנפין. Okay, so this is a lot of esoteric terminology, so we're kind of just going to get through it and I'm going to try to explain the gist. So he's saying, והיינו חוכמה דטעמי מצוות, אלא שהוא ככלותם המתהפך, ונעוץ תחילתן בסופן, והוא כוח האינסוף ברוך הוא לברוא יש מאין, ולא על ידי עילה ועלול. שיהיה העלול מוקף מעילתו ובטל במציאותו, רק יהיה היש דבר נפרד מאלוקות, בכדי שיהיה מעציב ברוך הוא מלך על כל הנפרדים, על ידי שיקיימו מצוותיו שיצווה עליהם. וסוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה, ולכן אמרו לירושלמי, ולית לרבי שמעון שמפסיק ללולב וכולי, וכל הלומד שלא לעשות נוח לו שנתהפכה שלייתו על פניו. So the again, that was a lot of that was pretty esoteric. Um, I'm not really able to kind of explain all of that, but the gist of it is that, as we said, so Torah comes from this sort of higher, this persona which stands in a relationship of giving or bestowing to the persona from which comes from which comes mitzvah. By the way, the word persona literally means mask, so that's kind of a good way to look at these parts of him. Anyway, so we're saying, but fundamentally, the the mitzvahs come from an even higher place than the source of the Torah. The source of the Torah is from wisdom, and the source of the mitzvahs is from God's will. Now, when we say the source, no, we're talking about the source of the Torah. We're talking about the sort of understanding the mitzvahs, right? Because that's what fundamentally the Torah is. The Torah is the commandments. And so he's saying it was God's desire that these commandments be fulfilled, right? And the reasons for them are almost secondary. First and foremost, God desired to have people fulfill these commandments. And the reasons sort of come down from that. And we're saying fundamentally this comes from God's will, which is God's power to create ex nihilo, to create from nothing. So what does this mean? This means again that God's will is free, completely free. There's nothing that forces it to do what it does. God just wills it. And it was his desire that there should be other things besides himself that he will create. And he'll give them, to a degree, their own existence. And after doing that, he desired to rule over them. Right? He wanted his kingship, his lordship to be revealed. He desired to be called Lord of all. And he is called Lord of all when people fulfill his will, his commandments. And he says, he who learns not in order to fulfill the commandments, it's better that he were to die in the womb. All these very, very harsh things. And it's because Judaism is not a Gnostic cult. Judaism is not about sort of, oh well you know this, therefore you're better. No, it's you're in a covenant with God and you fulfill his commandments. If you fulfill his commandments, you're doing his will. And that's the best thing you can be doing. How well you know things, well, that's very nice for you. But the point is to serve God, fundamentally. Okay? כי השלייה נוצרה תחילה מהטיפה, והיא לבדה הייתה עיקר הוולד עד 40 יום שהתחיל עצמות הוולד. Okay? So he's saying that he sort of takes this analogy, he's saying that Chachamim said that if somebody who learns not in order to fulfill God's will, it is better that that his placenta were to smother him in the womb. And he's saying the placenta is sort of actually the origin of the child. Right? It is the first thing that is created by the child. It's fundamentally the placenta. Or it's created from the first, or it's created first. I'm not exactly sure what he means. In other words, is there only a placenta? Then the child is created, and then the child is created, or they created simultaneously, or they created sort of in parallel, except one begins first. I think it's the second one. But what he's saying is that, he's saying the child itself is like the Torah, and the placenta, even though it looks like it's there to nurse the child and then to be discarded, you might think that, but it actually comes first. It's actually where all the life comes from. Think about it that way as well. And if you sort of discard that, certainly while in the womb, if you discard that which nourishes you, you die. He's saying, so the commandments are the root and the sort of great and sort of the most important part of the Torah itself. Even though mitzvahs are physical and bodily, right? That Torah and Torah is wisdom, knowledge. Except, again, it is only in the external expression that mitzvahs are really, excuse me. Right, he's saying the mitzvahs are the external aspect, and the Torah is the internal aspect. Exoteric and esoteric. Right, you could say the mitzvahs being the exoteric aspect, you might think that they're, you know, sort of an outer shell that needs to be discarded. And he's saying, no, they're the point, but they need to be given life. And that happens through learning the Torah, through understanding what you need to do, why you need to do it, and how you need to do it, and so on. Okay, so that's all for today, and I'll continue tomorrow, God willing. Take care.